Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. And today I review with a bit of a difference because we're talking pad rolling. I don't know if I'm actually reviewing these pads so much as just sharing some different thoughts and measurements about how they sound. I want to start off by saying a huge thanks to Zach and Bevan from ZMF Headphones for sending me a whole bunch of pads for me to try, to test on the different headphones, and to share my thoughts with you. This is going to be largely focused on these pads on the ZMF Vérité Open and the Vérité Closed. I've already done a bit of pad rolling talk for the ZMF Atriums. That's in the Atrium review, so go check that one out if you're interested. This one's going to be much more focused on the Vérités, both the Open and the Closed. I should also say a huge thanks to Zach and Bevan for leaving the Vérité Closed with me for as long as they did. I did my review of those way back now, it seems, and I'm only just getting around to recording this video of the pad rolling, which means I've also only just returned the lone pair of VCs, so thanks Zach and Bevan for letting me hang on to them for so long to produce this video. One final point before we get into the content is to let you know that there's not much to look at in this video. I'm going to try and keep it interesting. I might grab a few pads and show you along the way, but I've got no glamour video, no real B-roll because there's really not much to see. So hopefully I can keep it interesting, and now let's dive in and start talking pads. And we probably should start by talking about why pads matter. Some of you might be sitting there, if you've never rolled pads before, you might be sitting there thinking, what's the point? They're just bits of foam and leather or velour or whatever the covering is. The driver's what matters, the cup's what matters. That might be what you're thinking. And so I wanted to clarify why pads are actually really important. And if you think about it as if it's a speaker, the pads are essentially the room that the speaker driver is operating in. So if we pick up the Vérités here, and for anyone wondering, it's a Firestone audio headphone stand. I get asked about it all the time. I don't think they make them anymore. Otherwise, I'd share a link with you, but I don't think one exists. And so if we look at the Vérité Opens here, you've got the cup obviously on the back. So this is where the driver's sitting. The rear wave off the driver is going to go into that cup, and hopefully any reflections and resonance are going to be damped effectively within the cup. Obviously, in the case of Vérités, we know they are because they sound great. But then in front of the driver, we've got the pad here, and that's the only thing between the front of the driver and your ears and the side of your head. So essentially the sides of the actual pad are going to be like the walls in the room, how they reflect sound, how they absorb sound, how big the space is, how small the space is. They're also controlling how far the driver is from your ear, and that changes our perception of sound. And then finally, they're also going to change, depending on the material, how tightly the headphone seals to your head. And that's going to change the amount of sound pressure created, potentially at different frequencies. There's so much going on. And so that's why I'm saying that pads are a really important part of how a headphone sounds. Some of you are going to know this. You're going to be rolling your eyes going, duh, of course. But there's others that might not have ever played with pad rolling before. So I can't stress enough, pads have a huge impact on the sound of the headphone. And as we're going to discover in a moment, that's where a lot of fun can be had, particularly with brands like ZMF that make headphones for pad rolling. And so with that in mind, let's start talking about one very general characteristic of pads, and that's about whether or not they're solid or they're perforated. And this is going to change from one brand to another as to how this plays out. What I've found with the ZMF headphones is that it really matters whether they're perforated or solid, and it's going to depend on the headphone itself. What I mean by that, let me put these down. What I mean by that is that if you've got a closed back ZMF headphone like a Vérité Closed, you're going to want to use solid pads. If you've got an open back ZMF headphone, you're most likely going to want to use perforated pads. And the reason for that is it completely changes the sound profile. And what I find specifically with the ZMFs is that if you swap the solids onto an open headphone and the perforated onto a closed headphone, it's going to really skew the frequency response. Now, if you like that, if that's what you want, go for your life. I'm not telling you what's right or wrong here. But my point is that if you want to stay somewhat true to the original tuning of the headphone and just adjust it a little bit to your taste, then you're best off sticking with perforated on open and solid on closed. If you put a perforated pad on one of the closed headphones, you're going to suck the bottom out of the bass. And vice versa, if you put a solid pad on an open headphone, you're going to massively boost the bass. So be aware of that, play with it if you want to, but just be prepared for some significant sound quality changes, and in my opinion, rarely for the better if you start to switch which type of pads go on which headphone. With those general things said though, let's talk specifics. So we're going to jump over to the Vérité Open. Before I get into this, I just want to mention I do have some other ZMF headphones on the way from Zach. So I'm going to very soon have the Calderas here, and also I'm expecting to have the Auteur Classics. So I'll cover off some pad rolling on those in those videos. So if you're looking for that, don't bother commenting down below and asking where that information is. I don't have it yet, but it absolutely is coming. And so this is going to focus entirely on the Vérité Opens, but it's also going to give you a good sense of how these pads perform on any of the Open ZMF headphones. I can't speak to other brands. Every brand has differences in how they tune, how they damp their headphones. So this is just going to be for ZMF Open headphones. Starting off with the Universe pads, on the Vérité Opens here, and the sound that the Universe perforated leather pads deliver is fast and clean. It's very snappy. It's quite a neutral sound. I personally find the sound of the Vérités in their stock form, with the stock pads in other words, to be a little bit lean on bass. I like a bit more body in the bass, but it's generally a very enjoyable sound overall. And the other thing I notice with the stock pads is that it creates a soundstage that's fairly shallow but quite wide. And again, that's an area that I prefer a bit more depth in my soundstage. So the Vérité Opens with the stock pads aren't my absolute favourite, and that's part of the joy of pad rolling, is to find ways to tweak the sound to fix those things that maybe aren't quite right for you, whether it's tonality or soundstage presentation, as we're about to see. Moving from the stock Universe perforated pads over to the Auteur hybrid perforated pads. And by Auteur hybrid what we mean, and I haven't got the perforated here but I've got the standard, what we mean there is that you've got on the front piece here, it's a velour or an Alcantara type front, and we've got leather around the sides and also on the inside. So this is the solid version, the perforated is identical, it's just got hole punched all through it. And moving from the Universe perforated leather pad on the Vérité Opens across to the Auteur hybrid perforated, what I found was that it brought more energy to the mid-range, and particularly the upper mid-range. It brought a bit more presence and a bit more life to the vocals at times. I thought it was actually really great for vocals, but the overall tonality is probably a little bit less balanced. So if you specifically want that extra bit of upper mid-range energy, then certainly an option like the Auteur hybrid perforated pads is great, but it can throw off the tonality just a little bit by putting that extra emphasis there. Specifically what I noticed is that it made things like a rim shot on a snare drum, that's where they hit the drum stick against the side of the snare drum, those things become a little bit more energetic, a little bit more forward, so it can emphasize those things a bit for better or worse. But interestingly enough, at the same time, and I'm putting this down to the fact that we've got this kind of velour surface against the head, which may not seal quite as well, what it's also doing is it's taking a little bit of the energy out of the music. It's smoothing things off just ever so slightly. We're only talking about a 1%, maybe 2% shift, but it's enough that it makes things just a little bit less aggressive. And again, that could be good or bad depending on your tastes. For me, I quite like that on the Vérité Opens because they are such a snappy, fast headphone to start with that taming that sense of attack and speed a little bit can actually be much more relaxing. Others, though, will say that's exactly what I like about the Vérité Open, and that's the beauty of pad rolling. And by the way, pads like this come in at around about $80 to $100 generally, depending on the brands that you're buying. And so it's not an expensive thing to buy a couple of sets of pads, especially if we're talking about a set of headphones that are a couple of grand. This can be quite a nice investment to give you a couple of different flavours of an expensive headphone like these. But moving on from the Auteur hybrid perforated, let's now talk about the BE2 perforated pads. And specifically the BE2 suedes. I know a lot of people love the BE2 suedes on the Vérité Opens, and I do agree. They're a very, very nice match. Much like the hybrid pads that I just mentioned, the suede pads also sort of tame some of the energy a little bit. They take a little bit of bite out of the Vérité Opens. Again, for better or worse, I quite like it. These have less upper mid emphasis compared to, say, the Auteur hybrids that we just spoke about, but they also make the soundstage a bit more intimate because they're a shallower pad. And so generally the rule of thumb is that the deeper the pads go, the more sense of space you're going to get in the soundstage. There are other things that play into it, so it's not absolutely hard and fast, but that's one way to start looking at it. I find the tonal balance from the BE2 suedes to be excellent, and again, we're only talking about perforated pads on the Vérité Opens. I find the tonal balance there to be fantastic. It tames the treble a little bit compared to the Universe leather pads, but it doesn't get too soft or too muddy, so you're still enjoying the energy and kind of the sort of speed and the clarity of the Vérités. But at the same time, they're not getting too aggressive or too harsh on anything. Not that I find the Vérités ever really get harsh, but they are a very energetic and snappy driver. And for me, I actually like to just pull that back ever so slightly, and the BE2 suedes do that for me. And so at this point, moving through these different pads, for me, the BE2 suede perforated were the preference so far. They're the pad that so far would have stayed on the Vérités. But I wasn't done yet, so I moved on to the BE2 leather perforated, so exactly the same dimensions of pad, but with different materials. And these were much more similar to the Universe leather pads, but just with a bit less bass weight and bass presence. The sound is very clean and articulate, with lots of detail in the upper registers in particular. Because that bass has been pulled back a little bit by these pads, it lets you hear a lot more into the upper mids and into the treble. I don't feel like it emphasises them or pushes them forward so much as pulls back the bass. Once again, because of the shallower pad design compared to the Universe, the soundstage is a bit more intimate. But what I found interestingly was that the image focus, so the ability to kind of imagine exactly where each sound is in space, that got better with the BE2 leathers. And so they didn't quite knock off the BE2 suede perforated for me. I still was preferring the BE2 suedes at this point, but the BE2 leathers are a nice choice. I did have one more pad to go to though, and that was the Auteur leather perforated. So unlike the Auteur hybrid, this is now an all leather version of the Auteur pad. So it's got the leather on the sides, on the inside surface around the ears, and also touching the skin. And these give the Vérité Opens a thicker, meatier sound. It produces a very tight image focus, so somewhat similar to the BE2 leather that I just described. And whilst it creates a slightly more intimate presentation, meaning that everything feels a bit closer to you, it gives you noticeably more access, I'd say, to the mid-range details. Because the treble, I think, is a little bit tamed by these pads, or maybe the mid-range and bass is a little bit boosted, but the end result is that you're getting more focus on the mid-range, and I really enjoy that. The treble is still definitely very present with the Auteur pads, and on certain recordings it can actually get a little bit too harsh sometimes. So it's going to be a pad that I think is going to work really well with a smoother system. Maybe if you've got an R2R DAC and you're looking to add a bit of attack via your headphones. That's where I could see this working really well. Something else that might be worth mentioning is that putting the Auteur leather pads, the perforated leather pads, on the Vérité Opens actually brought them a step closer to what I like about the atriums. And that is that it might have reduced the width of the soundstage a bit, but it gave me slightly more sense of overall depth in the soundstage. It definitely doesn't turn the Vérité Open into an atrium. There's a lot more going on that makes the atrium what they are. But it was interesting to hear that the pad did actually give me a little bit more sense of that depth in the soundstage and less width, whereas the normal sort of stock setup of the Vérité Open is all width with minimal depth. And so we've got some interesting choices to play with. Because my first step in this process was just to see what I was hearing from each pad, I hadn't really thought about it yet in terms of which ones I would rate at what level, and so I chose what I thought were my three favourites and put them up against one another. And that meant putting the Universe leather up against the BE2 suede, up against the Auteur leather, all perforated once again. For this test, one of the tracks I used was I Can't Dance by Genesis. And starting with the Auteur leather, the opening guitars on this track were really rich and resonant, but with a good sense of attack and clarity. Phil Collins' vocals felt like they were kind of about level with my forward in terms of depth, and very, very well focused in the soundstage. I also felt like the percussive elements in this track had a really great sense of clarity and tonality, so it sounded accurate and sounded very well defined, very clean, a good sense of attack and a good sense of texture. Moving over to the BE2 suede, and it was really interesting. The change in tonality suddenly had me more aware of the percussion that's happening on the offbeats, so on the 2s and the 4s. Those guitars that I mentioned before now had a little bit less presence. And the overall sound is a little bit less energetic, I'd say, from the BE2 suedes, and that could be in a good way depending on you. Phil Collins' vocals are a little bit brighter sounding and they're a bit higher in the soundstage, so it didn't so much go deeper, but it went a little bit higher up. I also found that with the BE2 suedes, that soundstage was a little bit smaller and didn't have quite the same amount of depth either. On top of that, the image is a little bit less focused than it was from the Auteur leathers. And so at this point, the Auteur leathers were for me the better choice. The BE2 suede still sounds great, but the Auteur leathers were the ones that I wanted to take forward and check out how they compared with the stock Universe leather. And interestingly enough, the Universe leather kind of sits right between the BE2 suede and the Auteur leather. The guitars have more body than the BE2, but more texture than the Auteur. And with the Universe leather, there's a certain percussive element within this mix that's like a wooden sounding percussion, and that is more brought forward by the Universe than either of the other pads. And this is where things get interesting, and it can depend a lot on the track you're listening to, the genres you're listening to. Different pads bring forward different elements of the mix ever so slightly just by altering the tonality a little bit of the frequency response. So it can be quite challenging doing pad rolling because from one track to the next, different pads have different benefits. Carrying on though with the Universe pads for now, something else that I noticed was that these are probably the shallowest sounding pads of all. It actually brought Phil Collins' vocals for me inside my head. So rather than it being level with the forward, it was now just inside the forward in terms of the space of the soundstage. And so as I listen more and more, I think tonally the Universe leather pads are probably the most accurate, the most natural, the most kind of pleasurable. I don't know how you want to describe it, but tonally I think the Universe leather pads are probably more right. However, what I found as I went through this listening test was that I was more consistently preferring the Auteur leather pad over the Universe. And that was probably to do with the combination of the tonality still being good, but the spatial presentations being more to my liking. Before I wrapped up there though, I did want to try some classical music because I know a lot of people enjoy the Vérités for classical. I'm one of them. And so moving over to Capriccio Italian for orchestra from Opus 45, what I found was that the BE2 suede pads for this were really good if you like to hear more texture, more sort of the individual sounds and characteristics of the orchestra, but they did like the body and the weight. So when you wanted to hear the full orchestra with its full power, you didn't necessarily get that sense of oomph and body of the orchestra, but you were hearing more of the texture from the strings, texture from the woodwind, the percussion. You could hear more of those nuances at the expense of that weight and body. The Universe leather again offered that excellent tonality that I talked about before. It has a good sense of body and texture, but it doesn't provide the scale in the soundstage that I was often looking for. And that's where, again, for me, the Auteur leather did come to the front. It might be a little bit too smooth for some people. It definitely has a slightly richer tonality than the Universe pads. But for me, it seemed to more closely resemble what I've experienced in live performance situations. It sounded more true to life, more like I'd expect if I was actually sitting in an auditorium, and at the same time, a little bit more relaxing than the Universe leathers. And so for me, the Auteur leather is the choice across the board, but I definitely think the BE2 suede is a great choice if you want that more textural, slightly lighter handed approach in terms of the amount of body and presence of the headphone. And then the Universe leather is a great choice. I totally understand why Zach and Bevan have made it their standard, because tonally it's a really well balanced pad, and whilst I would like a bit more soundstage presentation from it, it's tonally a very pleasing and very natural sound. So those are my 3 top pads. None of the perforated pads are bad by any stretch, and I think it's a great idea to roll through them and check out what you like for your preferences, your source chain, etc. But the pad that I'll be leaving on my Vérité Opens is absolutely the Auteur perforated leather. And so that wraps up the open pads on the Vérité Open. Let's now turn to the Vérité Closed. Trying to work out what gear you should buy next? Have a look at the Passion for Sound Recommends link down in the description below. Clicking on the link will take you through to my Patreon page, and specifically a post where you can click on the Airtable image to go through to my recommended product database. Once you're in the database, you can use the filter button up the top to choose which sorts of product types you want to have a look at, maybe headphones, maybe DACs, maybe amps. Choose the one or ones that you want to see from this list, and then you can also sort the list by price if you want to, or other features as well. You'll then see a consolidated list just of the product types you want to have a look at, including things like what the retail price was when I last checked. You've got links to my reviews of each product, and then also links to where you can go and buy them. Feel free to play around with the filters and sorting options as much as you like to find the gear you're looking for, and I hope that this database points you in just the right direction for you. So happy hunting, happy listening, and now let's get back to the review. As I've already said, closed back ZMF headphones are designed for the solid pads, and so everything I'm going to be talking about here are solid variants. The Vérité Closed that Zach sent out to me review have the Auteur leather pads on them, and so that's what I'm considering as stock for the purpose of this roundup. The sound from the Vérité Closed with the Auteur leather pads is punchy, it's a little bit mid-forward, they produce a decent amount of space and depth, particularly for closed back, and I'd say the image focus and separation of sounds in the soundstage is solid, but probably not exceptional. Moving over to the Universe suede pad, and what I found was that it sort of tames the attack, tames the energy a little bit of the music. So the leading edges of notes become a little bit softer, for better or worse. It also brings the upper mid-range forward a little bit, and creates a slightly leaner sort of overall sound. In terms of the imaging presentation, I feel like the Universe suede pads are giving a slightly more focused image compared to the Auteur leather pads, and it's also pushing the soundstage a little bit further away and a touch higher as well. Going from the Universe suede to the Universe leather though, and that completely changes the presentation. Suddenly it's a very left-right presentation and very much an inside-the-head experience. The sound is actually quite lean compared to the stock pads being the Auteur leather pads, and there's a lot of emphasis on the mid-bass and the mids compared to the more balanced overall tonality of the Auteur pads. I was actually quite surprised at how big of a difference there was on this one. And that's not to say it's bad, it's actually still quite enjoyable, it's just very different from what I was hearing in the stock form. The final pad that I had to try was the Auteur hybrid. I spoke about that before, that's the one I've got here. And again, just to recap, or in case you skip straight to the Vérité Closed section here, that means that we've got a velour or suede section on the front of the pad, the bit that touches the skin, and then the sides, both the outside and the inside edges, are going to be leather. The sound I heard from that was actually not that different from the full leather Auteur pad. So what that means here is we've got 2 pads, the Auteur leather and the Auteur hybrid. Both of them use exactly the same dimensions. I believe they're going to be using the same foam on the inside. The only difference is that this facing surface here is either suede or leather. And I found it was only a very subtle difference between the hybrid or the solid leather, but they were also my 2 favourites, so I decided to compare them more directly. One of the tracks I used for the comparison was Liability by Lord. And with the stock pads being the Auteur solid pads, what I was hearing was a soundstage and a presentation that was quite inside the head once again. The soundstage was relatively compact, and it was all kind of encased between forehead and ears and not going too far back, so kind of level with the ears and forward to the forehead. The vocal in this track was really well focused with the stock pad, and there was a nice sense of texture as well in the vocals. What I noticed as I listened though was that it was like everything else in the mix was taking a back seat. So the vocal was really prominent in the mix, and everything else was kind of pushed behind it. And that's probably just the way the mix is done. I really liked what I was hearing because it let me really hone in on the vocals, the lyrics, etc. Changing over to the hybrid pads, and the vocals remained quite inside the head, possibly even more so. It might have pulled them even further back, but it's hard to say because it does take a little bit of time to switch between pads, so there's a little bit of auditory memory issue here. But one thing that I did clearly notice with the hybrid pads was that it brought some of the backing instrumentation a little bit more forward. So the vocal was still easy to focus on, but it wasn't quite as separated from the backing mix. And I don't know what's correct here. I've got no way of knowing how this is meant to sound. It was just really interesting to me that tiny change of just a velour front face here, or a suede front face, whatever you want to call it, that was enough to just change the presentation of the mix. But I wasn't getting a lot of insight from this into liability on this particular comparison, so I moved on to a different track, and specifically Even Trolls Love Rock and Roll by Tony Joe White. I started with the hybrids this time, and they were producing a good sense of space, but again largely left to right, not very much depth at all. There was an excellent sense of clarity and detail for the instruments, and also a good sense of separation between the instruments within the soundstage. And I described the overall delivery with these pads on as kind of energetic but smooth. There was no loss of dynamics, there was no lack of fun and engagement, but it was also smooth and very easy to enjoy. Moving back to the Auteur leather pads, and what I found was that it closed in the soundstage a little bit. So what I mean by that is I think it just reduced the sense of left-right split a little bit, but it also made it a more spherical stage. So I think what's happened is it's pulled in the sides, but given me a bit more depth. And it's probably in that regard a little bit more of a natural presentation of the sound. The leather pads also added a bit of energy into the leading edges of notes, so a greater sense of attack. And I personally think I prefer the slightly smoother sound from the hybrids, but it's going to depend a lot on the system you're listening to. And in many other ways, the tonality, everything else is very, very similar between these two. So for me, it's really just a subtle shift in the kind of staging presentation, the amount of space in the soundstage, and also the amount of attack from the headphones. I feel like the hybrids maybe make some of the mid-range just a little bit more available, and that's probably because it's taking some of the edge off the upper frequencies. So it's not so much pulling back on the treble, but it's just changing the way the treble hits your ears. It's just smoothing it off, taking a touch of the energy or the attack out of it, and I think that allows us to kind of hear through the treble and into the mids more. And so for me, it's a really close call on the Vérité Closed. I found with the pads that I've got here, and no doubt there's others that would be great to try, but with the pads that I had here, for me it really just came down to the Auteur leather or the Auteur hybrid. And it was a really tough call, but the ones that I chose to stick with until I sent the Vérité Closed back were the Auteur hybrids here. I think both are excellent, but I just prefer that slightly more relaxed sound, that slightly kind of pulled back amount of energy that the Auteur hybrids gave me. And so hopefully this has given you some insights into the different pad options that you could try on your ZMF headphones, or indeed other headphones that take ZMF pads. It's definitely a very complicated thing to try because there's so many variables between taste, the music you're listening to, both the individual tracks but also the genres, the gear that you've got, the source chain. There's so many different variables, and that's why I would recommend after you've had a listen to this review, you've worked out which ones sound like you might be interested in, grab a couple and give them a try for yourself. As I said at the beginning, if you're also itching for pad rolling information about the Auteur Classic and or the Caldera, then do stay tuned. Make sure you hit the subscribe button because they're going to be coming in 2023. For now though, I hope you found this review useful or interesting, and if you have, as always, I'd love it if you hit the like button, consider subscribing and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music and maybe the pad rolling, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.